Our world, as we are all aware of, is more divided than ever. One problem would have been bad enough, but combination of all is overwhelming. Underlying many of these issues which plagues humanity today is our compulsive addiction with our thoughts and hyper identification with the ego. Before we even start to think about what's happening in the outer world, what we desperately need is an inward revolution, a deep realization of who we truly are and how we relate to the existence. My guest for this exploration is Noelle Shantler, a beautiful, beautiful soul, the founder of Tender Serene Coaching, a relationship coach who specializes in healing of codependency through yogic teachings. This is a powerful conversation about self-realization. So without further ado, let's wake up. Anyways, coming to I always say self-actualization. Coming to self-realization, we have to start from the start, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's start from your childhood. How was you as a kid, and at what point in time your journey towards self-realization started?
Great question. So I was always like a really deep thinker as a kid, even like always asking those big questions.
Yeah.
You know, why am I here? Like, what does this mean? That kind of thing. And I didn't really have the kind of childhood where I had access to answers to those questions. I had a typical sort of kind of middle class upbringing in America and was sort of like forced to go to church kind of thing, even though I didn't really understand what that meant either. So I was always like, I think my path would be the one that kind of comes out of great suffering. There are so many sages that we talk about, great thinkers and actualized people who really from the time they were a little child, everybody just knew that they were like an enlightened being, and that was not me. I suffered deeply as a child and throughout most of my life. And mostly because of, like I said, not feeling like I didn't have access to the answers to those questions.
Yes.
That I didn't really fully understand my experience, and I didn't really feel I had access to the wisdom that would help me to understand. So I wasn't really able to, at least in my view, I wasn't able to have access to that wisdom or that help until I became an adult, and I started to seek out, people who could help me with my depression, people who could help me with my suicidal thoughts. And so I started seeing therapists a lot. I started working with different therapists and trying to use what we would define as Western psychology, to try to find some peace.
Yeah.
And understand my life and understand myself better. And it's really interesting because each therapist that I worked with taught me something important. You know what I mean? Each one of them had an impact on my life and taught me something different that kind of moved me along on my path. And eventually, I mean, I was really surprised to find that some of my psychologists also had this other side to them that I didn't expect from someone who I saw as a scientist. some of my therapists also introduced me to this whole world of spirituality, which I wasn't expecting that. And I was like, wow, because I didn't really give much thought to like God or, a spiritual path until this one therapist introduced me to it. She introduced me to the idea of law of attraction, which is a pretty kind of like hot topic, I guess, has been for maybe the last 20 years or so. And simultaneously, while I was learning about law of attraction, I got really interested in yoga too. So I had these two like really big concepts that I was sort of being indoctrinated, but we'll say initiated. I was being initiated into these really heavy like traditions, really like dense traditions, especially yoga, because I mean, it's a concept that has been around for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And so I got like really, really deeply into this, like how you picture like a bell curve. Like I was kind of going along like this with my psychology path. And then like once I discovered these two, it was like, whoosh, like I went like so deeply into those two things. I got really, really into those two things because the healing power of those two ideas really started to move through me, and I really started to feel at peace and feel better and feel like I had some concrete understanding of who I was and my life experience and what it meant, what it means, and all of those questions that I had as a kid that I couldn't wrap my head around. I started to be able to feel at peace with that. So if that gives you enough about my childhood, I'm open to hearing your thoughts or other questions that you have, but that's kind of my path in a nutshell.
No, you described it pretty well, and they were great highlights. And what clicked my mind is this: what I have found common among people who are on this path is this combination of curiosity and suffering. Right? So, what do you think is the relation of curiosity, suffering, and self-realization?
That's a really beautiful question, like a really beautiful connection to make. Curiosity and suffering. So I think that, and I'm just going to describe from my experience. Obviously, everyone has their own experience, so everyone's going to have a different take on this. But when I, like I described to you, when I was a child and I had that curiosity, I think a lot of times if we have that curiosity and we feel like maybe the answers aren't coming, or like we push really hard for something because like, especially in the West, we're like a gratification culture, right? So it's like we want something and we expect it, and when it's not there, suffering, right? So that's kind of a really important thing, I think, in our in the way that we relate to ourselves and in the way that we relate to our life, is kind of coming to like a certain amount of acceptance of the way that things unfold. It's when we start to have that resistance, right, and that push against, that we encounter greater suffering. And suffering is really an important realization that I've come to, is that suffering is a tool.
Right.
Suffering is actually a necessary component of our realization. And our acceptance of that really helps us to create a more beautiful path, a more beautiful journey for ourselves. When we encounter suffering, a lot of times our instinct, like we were talking about, you and I talked about before, our instinct is to push against the suffering and to try and resist the things that we don't like and pull toward us the things that we do. And it's this constant pushing and pulling, and we try so hard to be in control of our life experience, that we miss out on the unfolding of our moments. And the way that we relate to our suffering is part of that.
Right.
So that took me a long time to figure that out, a lot of suffering. And we don't have to suffer as much as we do, suffering is important. And I think that it's important to know how to process and relate to our suffering. But there's also joy too. And, when we get too caught in our suffering or too caught in our joy, it creates this kind of karmic imbalance.
Yeah, we also talked about people get addicted to their suffering, and it's very hard to figure it out. Like you said, suffering is useful, and I totally agree with that. But the thing which is the hardest when it comes to suffering is to figure it out. Like, for example, you have suffering since your childhood, right? And you don't know any reality apart from that suffering. Okay, so you think there is just this, and
that's normal for you. Yeah.
And that's the normal, that's the known, and you're so scared of getting from that known to unknown, because you're not you'll not be familiar if you leave that suffering. Your whole existence, your whole identity is built upon that, your suffering, right?
Yeah, that's a really, really important point to make. I think most people, once they understand what self-realization is, they start to have that desire come in for that, right? Like they want that peace and that love. And it can be really scary to, when you start to experience changes in your identity. Like that's our ego, right? Like taking it back to Western psychology, like that's our ego, that's our identity. We've always identified with our suffering. It can be very kind of uncomfortable to step outside of that, and start to come into a different awareness.
Right.
That's,
and the big part of self-realization is to heal your wounds. So like yes, day before yesterday I was having a podcast, and the person mentioned that this wounds, this psychological pains, wounds we have, these becomes a barrier when it comes to self-realization. They are the things which are impeding you, so you're not able to see your reality, right? You are so immersed in your experience of reality that you can't see the reality, if you know what I mean.
Definitely can't see the forest for the trees, right? Like there's a really great wisdom keeper, spiritual teacher named Michael Singer, who was kind of formative for me in my experience of my journey. And he talks a lot about samskaras. Have you ever heard of this concept of samskaras?
How can't I live in India.
Exactly. So that, like, I tend to kind of think of that as the spiritual equivalent of trauma or wounds, right? Like we had an experience, and the energy of that experience what did not process correctly. It didn't pass through the wholeness of our being. It sort of got stuck, right? Like it got stuck within us. And when that happens, yes, like you said, like the rest of the energy of our life that needs to continuously pass through our being can't pass through. We can't experience life the way that we're supposed to, because we have this stuckness. So yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. The wounds and the trauma, I mean, I think it's important to revisit those, you know. I think it's important to look at our traumas and our wounds. You know, a lot of people call it shadow work, or inner child work, where you kind of, you're finding a way to relate to yourself that's different. You know, you're finding a way to look at your stuff and really like feel those emotions, like feel that suffering maybe that you couldn't deal with, like you couldn't deal with it, right? So you just pushed it away. You pushed it down.
To use Jungian perspective, you're not trying to eliminate it, you're trying to integrate it, right? There's a huge difference.
Yes, transform it, up level it. Yeah, absolutely. I love Jung and everything that he talks about with shadow work and our acceptance. So the healer's acceptance. And that's something I struggled with a lot as a healer too, in relating to my clients, and even just in relating to friends and family when they would have a problem and things like that. Like we have to accept ourselves first as we are, and all of our traumas, all of our darkness, all of our shadows, right? We have to accept all of that in order to be able to accept that in other people, in someone that we're healing or someone that is a loved one.
And I think we don't just stop on acceptance when we stop running away from our shadow and our trauma, which I'm still doing. I'm not claiming that I'm the perfect being.
It's a never-ending process, right? We'll never be done.
Right. So what I have observed, that when we bring that shadow into our awareness, slowly it starts to melt, right? It's not going away. It's like melting into your own being.
It's opening. It's like a flower, right? Like a,
because when you eliminate it, and a lot of people, when you talk from religious perspective and all that, a lot of them focus on eliminating. But what I think where they like miss the boat is, when you're into eliminating something, there is a lot of trapped energy in that. Okay.
Right.
And it will also go away. And there is a huge potential which you could have used in your growth, in your self-realization, which you just put it aside.
Right. Like the poisonous flower also is used for medicine, right? Like it's part, like it's part of our healing process. Like I have that awareness that everything, there's a reason for it, right? Like there's a reason for everything. That's that acceptance. And like you said, we don't just stop at acceptance. We're also, I think when you sent me the questions and you mentioned the definition of self-realization.
I was going to come to that.
Yeah, sorry. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but
no, it's all right.
To take it a step further from acceptance, I mean, acceptance is an important step. That's like sort of the first step, right? But then like to continue on that path, you actually come into harmony with it. So you actually like celebrate it. And that's when you start to have that loving energy like coming from within you, right? Like that is the relationship with life, where we start to come into harmony like with our moments. So we're not just accepting it, but we're also relating to it in a loving way. Like, oh yes, this, like, normally this shitty thing that happened, I love this. This is an opportunity to XYZ, or let me feel into this and see where it takes me.
Greatly put.
And yeah, so I think that's a big part of that definition of self-realization for me, is to come into harmony with all that is, to come into harmony with every piece of our experience, whether it's inner or outer, right? Because we've got those two worlds, right?
Yeah.
There's the outer world and the inner world. And I think that coming into harmony with those is really the goal, right? Like oneness is really the goal, to kind of merge the mind, body, soul, as
Until
cliche
there
as
will
that
be
sounds.
division inside you or outside, how can one be like in oneness with anything, right? Until there is division inside us. Like until there is this conflicting personalities, one personality want this, one personality want that, and we are like war inside ourselves all the time, and everybody can relate to that. Nobody talks about that. That's another matter.
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. So can I ask you a question then?
Sure.
Just really quick. What do you think, who are those like two voices? Like who do you think are those two warring voices inside? Like, is one of them the ego and one of them is the high self? Like, who are those two voices that are always is it just us arguing with ourselves? Like, what is it?
It's what I think is, it's just duality. Like everything in the universe, there is good and there is bad. All right. So if there will be pain, there will be happiness. If there will be light, there will be darkness. All right. So if I'll choose, one voice is just choosing happiness, so another voice is choosing unhappiness. If another voice is choosing happiness, so it's a battle between pleasure and pain.
That's great. That's a really good point. Yeah. There's like the little devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder.
Right.
And there,
though I will not say like these are two things. What I have discovered is this: there is only one thing, that's the same voice. I like to put it, voices are conflicting with each other. But what I have observed in myself, that's the same voice which is having conflict. Like it's a crazy monkey. It's jumping around here and there.
Right. The monkey mind.
The monkey mind. So it's the same voice which sometimes says this, sometimes says that. It's just our thoughts, right?
Yeah, I like that you're bringing up the concept of the voice in the head, because that's something that was really huge, at least for me, on my journey, and something, again, I'll bring up Michael Singer again, that he addresses a lot of that voice in the head, right? That's constantly talking. And even when most of us identify so much with that voice that we don't even realize that it's talking. We don't even realize, we just know that we have a feeling, right? Like we get a feeling in our heart space of fear or sadness or anger. And sometimes we don't even realize that it's not just the stimulus outside of us. There are also thoughts that are going through our head after that stimulus takes place, right? And so those thoughts are actually what comes before the feeling. And you mentioned, what was the other thing you mentioned in your notes about
let's first, I think we have defined.
I don't want to take it too far. Go ahead.
No, sure. Where you want to take it? We can jump around.
No, go ahead.
All right. I think we have defined self-realization, or aren't we? I think it would not be clear for many people who are still listening to us.
Definitely.
So let's define self-realization precisely, and then we'll move forward. Right?
Sure. Well, I think that definition, to be honest, is going to look different for everyone. Like I said, I mean, for me, self-realization is coming into harmony with your reality and with who you are, awareness of who and what you really are. That to me is self-realization, but it's perfectly okay for somebody else to have a different definition of that. Do you want to share your definition of that?
I like the word says it all, I think.
Sure.
Self-realization, the realization of your true self, I think that's
Right,
well put.
exactly. Yeah.
But
yeah, it's that awareness
you
of
don't have
who
to
and
confuse
what you are.
it with your, what I was looking for to define that people who haven't experienced it, they will confuse it like being yourself, like being your egoic self.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, there's that phrase that so many people love to say, and I hate this word, the word just be yourself, right? Like just, which that word just implies that that's an easy thing to do. It's an
Right.
easy thing to be yourself. And it's honestly the whole journey and that whole process of learning and understanding who you are.
It's
It's a
just like
lifelong
saying,
process.
just climb Mount Everest.
Right.
Just go on the top of the Mount Everest.
Just climb Everest. Yeah. That's great.
Anyways, so how does the staircase that leads to self-realization looks like in your mind?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. Well, I described a little bit about what that staircase has looked like for me, but again, there are as many ways to live as there are people in the world, right? Like
True.
everyone's journey to of self-realization. I don't want to say to self-realization because that implies that there's like a finish line, and there isn't, right? We all know that there's no finish line. Everyone's journey is so beautifully unique. But I think that, depending on kind of where you are, right, maybe on the emotional scale, depending on, your level of suffering. Some people spend a lot of time of their life, like a really big chunk of their life, really caught in their suffering. So I guess your staircase is going to look different depending on where you are in your suffering, or the other way of saying that is where you are in your joy. Because I think you have to bloom where you're at, right? Like you have to start where you are. And so maybe the beginning of that process is just opening oneself a little bit to maybe the things that bring you peace. I think that, I hate, this is another cliche, but following your joy. Starting to give yourself permission to explore who you are, explore what you're interested in, explore what brings you peace and what brings you joy. I know for me, like I really had to actively start giving myself permission to, like, read this book or listen to this speaker, or go to that yoga class. My yoga journey started with a very kind of westernized definition of yoga. It just was like, go to that yoga class and get in shape and, make your body look good and check out the hot dude at the yoga class. You know what I mean? So it's it starts with, it might start at that very superficial level, right? Like we go from out to in, like the gross to the subtle. So maybe just in recognizing if you have shame around that, if you have shame around where you're at, you know, start maybe just little pieces at a time, giving yourself permission to be okay with that, you know, like be okay with where you are, because that path will eventually lead you. It will eventually lead you inward. It will eventually lead you to the subtle places within. Yeah.
So,
does that answer your question?
Precisely. So we started with healing and joy. Follow your joy and work on your healing. Right there's where we start. That's the spot. And then comes the question, why the hell we are doing this? Why self-realize? What's the point?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
Just trying to look from the listener's perspective. So
yeah, no, this is great. That's a really good question. Well, I think for someone who's suffering greatly, that why question is a pretty simple question. You know, if someone is suffering greatly, you would do almost anything not to feel that suffering, right?
yes.
And I feel like that is a part of the game, right? That's part of, in my view, why the game is designed the way it's designed, why it's set up the way it's set up. Because yes, that I spent a lot of time asking that question, like, why am I suffering so much? Why does life require this much suffering? And so when I started to inch toward those answers, it was like you suffering, and I don't want to get too far into, you know, religion or anything like that. I'm not a religious person. I'm a spiritual person. But to me, when you start to have those conversations with yourself or with the universe, some people like to call it source, some people like to call it God.
Yeah.
When you start to have those conversations, you know, it brings us back to what we talked about before. Suffering brings us closer to oneness with all that is. I think personally it brings me into closer relationship with God. I don't have a problem calling it God now. I would have about maybe 5 years ago. I would have had a hard time calling it God, but I'm okay to call it that now.
Yeah.
But I know that's a triggering word for a lot of people because so many are and have been oppressed by religion. I feel like I've gotten away from your question a little bit. And can you refresh me what the question was again?
No, we were talking about what's the point of self-realization and why it's necessary. So, and I totally resonate with what you said. You don't have a problem with using the word God, because as you said, you like when you understand, like word is not the thing, like word is not, you can't get wet by the word water, right? So when you understand that word is not the actual thing, so word starts to matter less. Whatever word you want to use it, use it. Like people a lot of times get into
exactly. Yes.
Like I just want to drink water.
So true.
I'm thirsty. I don't care what do you want to call it.
Right. High C, kombucha, whatever it is, just give it to me. Yes, exactly. That's so true. Like as we get along this path, we become less dualistic, and the word for whatever it is matters less. Science, God, to me, it's all the same thing. Yeah.
So So the
Go ahead.
concept, I used to call it like my why, which is like when I think about why is why we are doing it and why we are having this conversation and why I'm doing whatever I'm doing and you are doing whatever you are doing. I use this word that we are creating a flourishing world. Okay. So it's
I
flourishing world
love
is
that.
kind of our utopia, and I know it's your utopia as well. This is the world in the future where there's the least amount of suffering for humanity and for other creatures as well. And every life, like being the most intelligent, like uh, you wanna call it being or animal or whatever, being the like so much intelligence, we have so much knowledge. Like how aren't we creating like this kind of flourishing world where every life is thriving, like self actualization and self realization is realizing your full potential, right? What it's not
Right.
depends on, like I'm not comparing my potential with your potential. Like you
Right.
have certain kind of potential, I have certain kind of potential, and every life is doing it except humans. You'll see two trees,
Right.
they both are reaching the sky without any comparison with each
Right.
other, right? So what
Our mind is, our
so
mind is this great gift, and it's
right.
also has the potential to be this horrible nightmare.
So let's talk about
Yes,
flourishing,
complete.
and if I have defined flourishing pretty well and you understand it, so let's talk about the relationship between flourishing and self-realization. Right? How can we use this path to create that utopia we have in our mind?
Yeah, that flourishing world. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Um, well, I think that this path of self-realization um, is also a way of becoming more conscious, right? Like becoming more
Yeah,
conscious of what we're doing and how we do it, and not just doing physically, but what's going on internally too.
yeah,
I think there is a lot of unconsciousness out there within human beings. Like you said, we have these incredible minds and this incredible logic that was meant to be a tool for us. Um, and there are many people who are externally achieving what the Western world would call great success.
right.
We have this idea and this definition of what success is, and our society has become so focused and driven by achieving that sort of external success that we're not conscious of what is going on internally. We're not honoring what is going on internally, and not just internally within ourselves, but internally within others, internally within the consciousness of the earth, the consciousness of animals, the consciousness of all the energies around us, right? All the manifestation, everything that has manifested
Right.
around us. And it's taken me a long time to start to come to my own acceptance of that too. So the acceptance of the world as it is, with the state that it's in. And right, like you said, this utopian manifestation that we would like to see. And so there's like, I almost see that as like a collective path, right? Like our collective self-realization, right? Like, so there's the world as it is, and then there's that utopian manifestation that we want to see, and then there's the path in between, right? So what you're talking about, I think, is how do we create that collective healing, that collective utopia, that beautiful flower that we know is possible. You know it in your heart. I know it in my heart. Like we have that belief that this is.
I will not call it a belief.
Yes, you're right. That
don't
inner
like that
knowing.
word.
How about that? That knowing, that inner knowing that we have, that this is a reality. I suppose that might be a first step to that path, is, like you said, that having that inner knowing, and inspiring that inner knowing in others, which is what you're doing. So, yeah, absolutely.
I think you used a great phrase, which I want to repeat again. Like, the journey starts where you are. Like, I've seen, like, I often use these kinds of statement ki, okay, society is doing this to us and society is doing this to us. But I'm coming from a place of realization that we collectively, like you use the word, like collectively we have to move towards it. So we ourselves are creating that society, right? Like, it's not like society is some other entity there and we are some separate entity somewhere else.
Right. Absolutely. It's that it starts with the individual. It does. It starts within us, right? I don't think that we can ask that of others until we ourselves are that example of healing, right? Like
Right.
we have to heal ourselves before we can ask that of others, you know. So that's a really important place. Yeah, acceptance of this whole experience as it is, right? So the acceptance of self and the acceptance of all that is. There was definitely a period of time on my path, and it still comes up for me. Like we both said, this is always an ongoing process that never ends.
Ending.
There's a period of time that I think a lot of people go through where they're almost like angry with God, you know, like, why are things this way? Like, why did you create us to feel so much suffering? And why is this? Yeah, like, you know,
why aren't you running the world according
we're
to me?
angry. Yeah, like, why doesn't everything just line up the way I want it? And the ironic, you know, kind of paradoxical reality of it is that when we let go of how we think things should be, that's when we start to really experience beauty. Like, that's when we start to really, when we surrender to the unfolding of life.
This is so powerful.
As it is. Yeah. That's a big one. And that's really, to me, the entire yogic practice.
Let's sink it in. Let's have few moments so it gets sink in what you have said just right now.
And awesome. I mean, these are teachings that are not mine. I mean, I share them. But these are teachings, wisdom teachings that have been passed down for thousands of years, right? Yes. So I'm sort of just relaying what I have learned and what I have experienced in my life, but it's certainly not original.
I would say the words might not be original, but I can sense that from where they are coming from is pretty like original.
Thank you for that.
It's just
I
language.
Received that.
You have to use it to communicate.
Yeah.
Anyways, so what are the books which have impacted your life a lot, or you have gifted them to your loved ones a lot?
Yeah, these are so I'll bring it back again to sort of the onset of my we'll say my trajectory, like where I started to really take off. I started reading a lot of books about law of attraction. So that started with Esther Hicks, who is the channeler of what she calls Abraham. And like I said, this is not the end all be all. This book for me was a step in the right direction of my path. So that was a really powerful book for me. And again, as far as, duality goes, a lot of people interpret what she says in this book as kind of like the one and only. And I ask that if you read that book, you take it for what it is, because it does describe law of attraction as an important process. Yeah. Law of attraction is also described in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Bible. It's just being expressed in a different way. And for me, that was the way that I was able to hear it. I had to hear it.
Let's talk about law of attraction a bit, because this topic, I think, is pretty much like people almost think it's shady.
Shady
in a way, like there's something.
Yeah, it's caught a bad rap the last few years. And I think what frightens people about it is that often it's interpreted as just a way of getting what you want. Like it's interpreted as
it's coming from a place of ego.
Right, or a place of unconsciousness. Yes, whether you want to call it evil or unconsciousness, coming from a place of lack of understanding. And yeah, there are a lot of people, just like in any philosophy or faith, there are people who are going to misinterpret it. There are a lot of people who misinterpret the Bible. There are a lot of people who misinterpret the Torah and the Quran. There are people who misinterpret the Gita. So all of these texts, there is wisdom there. And to me, it's all the same wisdom. A really big part of my path was, let me read as many of these texts as possible so that I can find the common thread, so that I can find the unifying truth, because it is there. That's an inner knowing that I have, that there is one unifying truth that we can come to. So whatever book it is you're going to read, whether it's, law of attraction, I think the book that I read was called Ask and It Is Given, is the first Esther Hicks book that I read. Right. And so when we read a text, I think we need to look at what is there for us. Take with you what feels like your truth. You know what I mean? Take from it what feels like your truth. And that is an important trust to have with yourself, to be able to read something or to be able to consider something, whether it's a philosophy or a religion or turning on the news, right? Like we have to be able to look at something from that deeper awareness and say, this feels like truth to me, and I can't hear this right now. You know what I'm saying? And just because I can't hear it right now doesn't mean I might not eventually be able to hear it. What's that?
You're not just ready, I think, like to hear some things.
Right.
Like some people might not be ready to hear this conversation.
This podcast. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when we can step back a little bit from our reactions, because we tend to be a very reactive society, especially in the West, if we can step back for a moment and tune in and say, you know what, this is something that's useful for me in my life right now. Yeah. And this is something that's not hitting yet. And that I don't need to demonize this entire philosophy or demonize this entire wisdom keeper, healer, faith, whatever you want to call it. I don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense. I can take a piece of wisdom that works for me and I can move on, to the next thing. I can apply this to my life and I can move on to the next dance. I think that is a really important step for people in becoming more conscious, is like us being able to consider something without reacting so quickly and extremely.
Yeah, go with a sense of skepticism and do whatever you want. Right?
Yeah, exactly. A discernment.
You don't have to accept whatever is written in the book. You can challenge it, play with it. Right?
Yes.
At the end, when you consume it, just burn it, because it's of no use for you when you have learned the things you want to learn. So
and it was really confusing for me for a long time, because when I became trained as a coach, I started applying a lot of law of attraction principles in my coaching, but I was also being trained as a yoga teacher at the same time. I was doing these trainings at the same time.
You have also been a psychology student, right? So I think it's pretty, like, you can view a thing from a lot of perspective. That's why I wanted to know your perspective on law of attraction, because as I see law of attraction, I'll let you complete, because I don't have that thorough understanding. But that reticular activating system which we have in our brains, if you know about it, it's a system in our brains which, when you feed your subconscious a lot of things, so it starts seeing, like, it's kind of I can explain, like, this is, suppose, your circle of importance, right? This is importance for you, and whatever you will put in this glass, your mind will think, okay, this is important for me, and now I have to pay attention, right? For example, when you buy a new car, like, suddenly that car is popping up, like, everywhere. You think, okay, everybody bought that car. No, it has become a part of your world. So now you're seeing the car everywhere. So I think the law of attraction, if I see from a psychology perspective, it works the same way. When somebody, something, some topic, right, becomes your focus of attention, so your mind is trying to help you subconsciously.
It's interesting too, because it was my psychologist that introduced me to law of attraction. So it's very ironic, that, anybody can be open to anything. But where it becomes useful, I think, so as you explore, if you decide to explore any literature on this, I think it becomes useful in there's something in it that's talked a lot about your vibration, right? Vibration is an important concept in law of attraction. And again, vibration is something that's talked a lot about in the Bhagavad Gita too, which is another book that I deeply love and would strongly recommend to anyone who's, even if you're not necessarily interested in yoga. It's a book of deep wisdom. The concept of vibration is talked about in both of those texts. The idea of tuning yourself and being aware of where you are, I suppose, on the emotional scale. Being aware of your emotions. And I do believe that our emotional state and our emotional vibration, our energy, you can even just call it your energy. I do believe that you will create more of what you are vibrating at. So if you are a person who's deeply suffering, I do believe that will be mirrored in your manifestations. That will be mirrored in your whatever you create, in whatever you your living situation, your relationships, your job. If you are deeply suffering, I don't think it's logical that you would create from that suffering, right? You would create from that place of suffering. So I do think it's important to be aware of where you are on that emotional scale, and that you can achieve a more loving vibration. You can achieve a more loving energy, and you can heal yourself with that. You can heal your life with that. So to me, that's where it becomes useful. I think a lot of people interpret it as, oh, I'm going to get whatever I want, you know? So
I'm vibrating with the frequency of Ferrari. Tomorrow I'll have a Ferrari on my doorstep. Magically.
Exactly.
What I am skeptical about law of attraction is, I can see the sense of it, but when you take this concept at some unrealistic dream zone, right? Like I'll go to Mars, and I start visualizing that I'll go to Mars and I'll be the king of Mars. Right? No matter how you visualize, it's unlikely that it's gonna happen. And right. So I think psychology, spirituality, your vibrations, your frequency, all of this, including what I mentioned, like your reticular activating system, the combination of all this, I think somehow, although I haven't figured it out yet, but I think somehow it works in a similar way, like the things you put out, they come back to you. But when you have these kinds of imagination and you go on to unrealistic world, I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna bring up the tantric path here for a minute, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but the tantric
path. This conversation is getting too interesting.
Well, so I get the sense that you have an idea about what I mean by Tantra. So I mean, the tantric path is the path of desire, right? So there are many yogic paths. There are many paths within the yogic tradition, and the tantric path has become overly associated in the world to do with sex, which it can be used for that, but so can any other type of yoga. The tantric path, I mean, essentially you become realized by burning through all of your desires, right? So you get the Ferrari, right? And then the point of getting the Ferrari is that once you get it, you realize that you don't need it because it's not going to make you happy for an extended period of time. So that tantric path is basically, you indulge in all these things, is the path of excess, right? You indulge in all of these things, and eventually the purpose of that path is that you burn it all off, and then you come to the realization that there is nothing that you need except for what is inside of you, right? Like everything that you need is inside of you. So it's not for me to judge how someone arrives at that path. You know, if somebody arrives at that path through law of attraction and through manifesting all of this, you know, riches that they thought that they wanted, great. You know, as long as they get I mean, you're going to get there eventually anyways. In my view, you know, if it takes you one lifetime or if it takes you a million.
If you're curious about something, go explore it. Eventually you're gonna get bored. You are gonna like rise above it. Not move beyond it, rise above it. Right.
And it was Ram Dass who said every method, every path is just a trap. Right? Like it's all a trap. It's all a game, you know, it's all a game. So just play the game, you know, take the curriculum, as he would say.
Right.
Don't take it too seriously, you know.
So now we have moved from the realm of we started, the funny thing is we started this conversation with self-realization. We already started on the mountain top.
And we worked our way down.
Worked our way down, and now we are like trying to go beyond that mountain. And you're talking about now self-transcendence. You're now we are transcending the self. Just explore yourself and yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it all relates, you know. It's like
it was fun.
My feminine mind having like the little noodles, right? They say women's mind is like spaghetti and men's minds are like a waffle. I don't fully believe that because everybody has masculine and feminine within them, but everything connects to us, you know, in the feminine.
I think you have like applied all the ingredients you had, and we have created
yeah, I gave you as much as I could, as much as we could
right now.
as much as we could fit into an hour. Yeah, I think we covered a lot.
I'll give it a listen. I'll listen to it again myself. So my last question: what message you have for the world? And it's a big one.
Oh, I'm gonna be cliche and just give you a Gandhi quote. Is that okay?
Sure.
So he said, "My life is my message," right? I suppose that as opposed to trying to sum it all up with, as we said, these futile words that fail to really encompass who we are and what we want to express. Who I am and the work that I do is my message.
Awesome.
I hope to just create healing and love and bring people some peace. Bring some peace to the world.
I'm grateful that you exist.
Oh, thank you. I received that fully. I'm grateful that you exist.
Thank you.
This has been such a privilege.
Same here. And I think we have sailed the ship pretty well. We have now reached the shore. So
we might have taken a few detours, but
yeah. So I'll ask you to come again sometime and have a conversation with me. It was a great experience.
Yes. I can't I can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you.